All right, guys. Well, I appreciate you guys coming in, and today we're going to be taking a look at some research that myself, Mary Kay Barfield, and Angela Masden were all a part of. We were actually researching, actually looking at student schedules as a way to potentially increase performance, and specifically reading, and specifically we're looking at sixth grade students. Again, we actually did this research at No Middle School, and I think it's really important to understand where the research was done. If you don't understand where the research was done, it may leave question as to what was the purpose behind the research, or what kind of drove the research to be conducted in the first place. So with that, just kind of a profile of the school. We'll take some time to kind of go through that. And No Middle School is actually located kind of in the greater downtown Louisville area. It's actually just outside of the University of Louisville. Actually shares grounds with two prominent schools here in Jefferson County Public Schools, and that's DuPont Manual High School, as well as the Youth Performing Arts School. We actually have 1,300, at least when we started this research, we had 1,320 students between grades 6 through 8. And we actually have two magnet programs here at No Middle School. We have a visual and performing arts magnet program, and we also have a gifted and talented program. So 51% of the students who attend the school are actually a part of our magnet programs. They're a part of our visual and performing arts program, or our gifted and talented program. Now 49% of those students actually attend the school for reasons outside of being a part of that magnet program. Those things can be that they live in the residential area of the school. It could be that they are enrolled in some of our ECE programs, Exceptional Childhood Education. They could be assigned to our English as Second Language, or ESL program, or they could have been assigned here because they could have been related to somebody else, or that goes to the school, or even that the district has reassigned them to the school. So NOS Resides area is a group of high poverty, the group is generally high poverty. 89% of the students who come from the Resides area are actually free and reduced lunch. It's a high minority neighborhood, 93% African American. NOS ECE programs are also diverse, and they include learning disabilities, as well as emotional and behavioral disabilities, and even functional mental disabilities. ECE students make up a total of about 9% of No Middle School. So NOS ESL program serves many languages and cultures, but mainly the students that are part of our ESL program are Somali and Mai now. That's actually changing. We've kind of seen that through the course of our research. We're actually starting to see a more diverse ESL program. Now, ESL students make up about 5% of the school's population. And overall, student enrollment's actually grown by about 35% in the last 5 years at No Middle School, so it's definitely been growing. It's, I believe it's the second or third largest middle school actually in the district. But as we've actually increased percentage-wise, we really haven't seen a change in the demographics. They've stayed relatively the same over those last 5 years. So NOS genders demographic are about 59% female, it's about 41% male. NOS racial demographics are about 41% African American, 48% white, and about 11% other. NOS average daily attendance is about 95%, which is really close, right about to that state average. Sorry about that. We have about 135 staff members within the school. About 67 of those are highly qualified classroom teachers. We have 4 resource teachers, 2 counselors, 4 assistant principals, 1 principal, and about 57 staff members in other supported roles in the school, whether they're instructional assistants, janitorial staff, working in the cafeteria, security guards, things of that nature. So really, we also need to kind of look at the school's needs and how the school actually goes about deciding what its needs actually are. So we're going to look at how learning and achievement gaps are identified within the school. So the following data sources are traditionally used within the school, and those are the Kentucky Performance Rating for Educational Progress, or KPREP, the district proficiency assessments, walkthrough data, non-cognitive data, so that would be things like motivation, grit, self-regulation, social skills, or other things like that that are maybe a little bit tougher to get in actual hard data. And then also discipline data. So when we're actually looking at this data, it's also important to know the teams that actually work to work with this data to kind of decide where the school needs to go. So we actually have an instructional leadership team. We call our ILT team here. We have a site-based decision-making council, professional learning communities, or PLCs, or also they meet in departments, so we can say departments as well. We have a leadership team, parent groups, and with that, I think it's also kind of important to understand what the progression is. How do these groups work together to kind of decide what those needs are? So here at Noll Middle School, the way that traditionally works is that if we kind of backtrack and we kind of look at this, we have we have our professional learning communities, leadership teams, and parent groups. We'll all kind of get together and decide what do they think are our priority areas. And they'll kind of define those priorities that they see. For instance, with the departments, they're going to look more specifically in their contents. What are the priorities within their departments? The leadership team will kind of look like more in the schools, and the parents will kind of look at it from a whole different perspective. What are the needs within the school? And they all report to the instructional leadership team, and there's individuals that are a part of each one of those groups who make up that instructional leadership team. Now, that instructional leadership team is going to go ahead, compile all those ideas, make one plan, our comprehensive school improvement plan. They then present that to our site-based decision-making council, and the site-based decision-making council will review that as well as many of the other data sources and either make recommendations for changes or go ahead and approve that. So, Noll Middle School findings. When you actually start looking at that data, when these groups started to do that, as we were deciding where our research was going to head, what they started to realize was that students were performing above the district and state average in the percent proficient and distinguished for the content areas on the KPREP, but our proficient distinguished ranged from 55.9% in writing to 62.5% in social studies.
George, could you come to the main office? George, could you come
where
to
we
the
started
main
to
office, please?
kind of notice a difference from that was actually looking at our GAP students and realizing that our GAP students are meeting proficiency at a higher level than the district in all areas except for reading and language mechanics in the state in writing. So you can kind of see here when we start to look at this chart, you can see that in the areas highlighted, these are the ones where we are actually scoring higher than the one next to it. For instance, in math, we're at 24.1, which puts us higher than the district, who's at 20.8% proficient, but below the state, who's at 26.1. It's a similar story in social studies, where again we're scoring higher than the district, but slightly lower than the state. And then in writing, we actually are scoring higher in the school, the district, as well as the state. Now, if we look at the areas of language mechanics and the areas of reading, we can see that we are slightly behind the district in language mechanics and a little further behind the state. And again, similar story with reading, slightly behind the district, and then again, a good little ways behind the state. And that was kind of what they started to realize. Now, we also found that we have a higher novice numbers as compared to the state among GAP students in reading, math, and social studies. And if you see that kind of breakdown, these are our percent novice. So in reading we had 32.7 compared to the state at 28.4, and math 28.7 compared to the state's 22.1, and social 7.5 to 16.0. So that kind of helps again to indicate that we're seeing that our GAP students are performing maybe a little bit lower than average compared to the state, and even sometimes compared to the district. even though our proficient was scoring very, very high, and our distinguished, again, scoring very, very well. So we kind of had this big divide in the school. So as a result, we kind of started to see some identified priorities. The priorities that we saw was to increase proficiency for GAP students in reading, math, and social studies. Those are all areas that we said we really need to work to increase that proficiency within the GAP group. Increase organizational effectiveness for designing, implementing, and evaluating programs, and improving instructional effectiveness. So the identified priorities, and this is kind of just the supporting data for that. When we said that we needed to increase proficiency for GAP students in reading, math, and social studies, again, the data just showed that we are just a little bit behind as a school to the state, as in we have a little bit higher number of students scoring novice than as compared to the state. And then again, when we started looking at increasing organizational effectiveness for designing, implementing, and evaluating programs, the school's fallen behind behind the average progress within the state, moving from a school within the 82nd percentile to a school within the 80th percentile. A lot of that is not necessarily because of a drastic or even any type of necessary reduction in the school, but it was more that the state was starting to perform at a higher level, and we were still kind of staying around where we were, and as a result, that ticked us down a couple percentile points. Now, when it came to improving instructional effectiveness, the school has seen an increase in novice for core subjects of math, reading, as well as a slow progression in many other content areas, and that was the reason that we identified that as a priority. And you can kind of see this is just kind of a good color-coded reference, because for this one you really are looking at kind of the grander scheme of things. And so you can kind of see that in any of these ones that are marked red are ones that we've seen any sort of decrease. It could be a slight decrease, it could be a big decrease, but any decrease is highlighted in red. Whereas in social studies and language arts, you see the yellow. Those are areas that we've actually seen some slight growth, and in the green are areas that we've seen some great growth. And again, this kind of speaks to why we had the priority area, because you can see that we had in reading a 36.3% proficient in 2015 as compared to a 28.9. That is a very sizable jump, and we again see pretty good jumps in social studies for proficient and writing for proficient. But again, it's just that some of those students who are already scoring novice or apprentice, we're finding more of them kind of falling back into that novice group. So at this point, we felt like we had gathered enough data that we could start to consider what can we do to make a difference to help make that positive change, and as a result, what could we begin to research? And so at that point, we came up with this question: will increasing low-performing readers' time in reading and language arts classrooms increase their reading level and performance in other content classrooms? So that was kind of the focus that we took. So at this point, we had to start kind of looking at what research had already been completed. And so as we began to kind of to research our literature here, we started to notice that despite there being a lot of research in a lot of areas that maybe had to do with schedules, there was very little research that had been conducted about how actual scheduling, or the increasing of time or decreasing in time in different areas, could actually affect classroom performance. So at this point, we started looking. We looked at block scheduling first. That was an area that had been highly looked at, and in block scheduling, there definitely seemed to be an increase in performance if the duration within one class period was increased. So with the block scheduling, where that time is increased per class, they did see a pretty big jump. And space presentations was another one, and so it kind of, in some areas you can almost look at it as contradictory towards the block scheduling, where they say increase the time. In space presentations, and we're looking at having gaps between the instruction of something, rather than covering multiple ideas in a class period. Cover one idea, move on to something else, and then come back to a similar idea or a building idea. but again, they saw gains with that. Enrichment classes were a big one, so taking the opportunity to have any type of class that would further the information already being learned in content classrooms, as well as intervention classes. So classes specifically developed to help students who had fallen behind in particular areas and helping them to catch up. There had been significant growth as a result of that. Response to intervention had been a big one as far as like scheduling, as far as bringing individuals into the classroom to help students who are already struggling to be more successful in those classrooms, and there had been gains seen through that. And one of the biggest ones that we saw was early intervention in education, or the idea of catching students but before they get too far behind. There's also a big idea behind evidence-based instruction and how that had showed to show growth within the classroom for students. And then the last one was computer-based reading. This was actually in the United Kingdom. They had focused on using computer-based software, computer-based programs to help students to increase their performance, and that was something that was also successful. So at this point we started to look at how can we go ahead and collect data that is going to help us to decide, is our adjusted schedules going to make a difference? So we decided that we had a couple different areas that we could look at, some data sources, because again we're looking at how can scheduling make a difference in all content classrooms, specifically focusing on increasing time in reading. And so we looked at the Scholastic Reading Assessment, or the SRI, and there was an August test and a December test that we would be kind of using as our beginning and end assessments. Then we also looked at proficiency assessments. Proficiency assessments are common assessments within the district. Every school within the district for a particular grade will have proficiency assessments specifically for us in math, reading, science, and social studies. And we were able to utilize Proficiency 1 and Proficiency 2 that correlated with our SRI test of December and August. And then also just the grading period grades for periods 1, 2, and 3, and specifically in math, English, science, social studies, and reading. Those are all areas that we were going to gather data and hopefully be able to find some correlation to whether or not adjusting schedules would make a difference. So at this point, it's important to understand how we use that data. How did we take the data that we gathered in those different areas and use them to be able to correlate findings. But before we do that, we have to understand that the way that we went about collecting this data was actually creating two different schedules. We decided to focus on 6th grade as a result of the literature that pointed to early intervention. That was the earliest grade within our school. And Group 1, their schedule in previous years had actually been to be moved out of regular education language arts classrooms and into more specific reading intervention classrooms. So we completely flipped the schedule on that. And we moved to those students being in 90 minutes of regular language arts classes. Really, it's 3 times a week plus one 70-minute class once a week. 60 minutes of reading and related arts classes 5 times a week. And then also intervention as needed. And actually these slides were flipped, so I apologize. So if we actually look at this, Group 1 also has the additional 40 minutes intervention reading class 3 times a week. So this is actually Group 1's schedule. Now Group 2 schedule is pretty much the same thing. And if you look at it, the only difference between Group 1 and Group 2 is Group 1 actually, so you can kind of ignore that, Group 1 actually has this 40-minute intervention, so an increased amount of time, whereas Group 2 did not have that. Okay. So when we started looking at the proficiency assessments, we're trying to decide how can we actually tabulate those proficiency assessments so that way we can actually get some sort of gauge on that. So what we did is the scores for each proficiency assessment were taken for every class or each group. Scores were placed in a different bar graph for each content area. And then each graph there was one bar representing the number of students who scored novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished for each assessment, and you guys will be able to see that exact chart here in a minute. For the SRI test, scores were gathered by student for SRI Test 1 and Test 2. An average for each test was found and actually charted in a bar graph where it showed Group 1 and 2 directly next to each other. And then scores for Test 1 and Test 2 were also sorted from highest to lowest for Group 1 as well as for Group 2. And then separate charts were created for Group 1 and Group 2 where the scores from highest to lowest were put on a linear chart so you could actually see their progress, which again you'll see here in just a minute. Lastly, for grading period grades, each student's grades were collected for the first, second, and third grading periods. Each grading period grade was then averaged for every class or every content area and then placed on a graph with all 5 content areas listed, and a bar was created to represent the average grade in each one of those content classes. So when we started to look at the results here of increasing time in language arts, we found some kind of interesting correlation. When you look at Group 1's Lexile score, so again remember that this is the group that has a greater amount of time devoted to reading and language arts-based classes. They have that extra 40 minutes a week, or 40 minutes 3 times a week. You can actually see that here, right here at the beginning, this darker line, the brown line, is actually the August Lexile score, and you can see that it starts out lower, and even though it does have a higher, they have the highest score of either test, you can see that when you look at December, you can see a progression. You can definitely see that progress was made generally across the board. And again, you'll see that when we look at our bar graph too. Now for Group 2, we didn't necessarily see that correlation. Their SRI scores, when you look at their overlay, again, this is all the scores tabulated, put highest to lowest, plotted on a linear chart. You see that they kind of mirror each other. And yeah, even though the lowest score was definitely still in August, with the higher score being in December, and that we can see little pockets of average growth, and they also have the highest point. When we look at them side by side, and this is really where you get the big picture, you can see that the average growth, so this is the average growth per student, is dramatically higher for the group that had the extra 40 minutes 3 times a week compared to the one that did not. And so this is the first time that we actually saw that that kind of potential increase in language arts actually having a positive effect in increasing student learning. Now, from this point, we start to move on to the proficiencies, and again, looking at the greater how does increasing language arts make a difference in all core content classes. And again, you're going to see that right in the front row is going to be the second proficiency that was given for each one of these charts, and in the back, you will see the first proficiency. So for Group 1 in math, we definitely saw some growth. At least we didn't see necessarily huge growth in the novice category, but we did see growth in those who were scoring apprentice. They had made some progress with more students scoring proficient. And for Group 1 in reading, again, here we actually don't see dramatic growth. And you can kind of see how more students ended up scoring novice for Group 1 in reading. In science, kind of the same story. Proficiency 1 students actually did better in Proficiency 1 than they did in Proficiency 2 for science. Again, this is with a group having the greater time in language arts. And finally, with social studies, we did see some growth in social studies. So for Group 1, we saw growth in reading, and we saw growth in social studies, but in these other areas, we weren't seeing the same growth. Now for Group 2, again, this is the group that did not have the 40 minutes of extra time in language arts. For math, we actually started with the last one. It was math and make sure we get that right. Math and social studies were our areas in which we had seen growth. Now on this side, we're looking at math. We see that with Group 2, they actually scored better on Proficiency 1 than Proficiency 2. With reading, we saw the same thing, scored better with Proficiency 2 than they did with Proficiency 1, as far as there was more students getting into the Proficient Distinguished, but we did see an increase in novice in Proficiency 2. And then we looked at Group 2 Science. You can see some growth for Proficiency 2. We're seeing a greater number of students in Apprentice and Proficient, and a decrease in the number of students scoring in the Novice category. And then with Social Studies, we saw pretty similar from Proficiency 1 to Proficiency 2. Now that moves us on to our last one, and that was grades. And when we looked at grades, just remember that we took the average score for each grading period in each content area per group. So for Group 1, for instance, math, each one of these bars represents the darkest one being grading period 1, the blue one in the center being grading period 2, and the last one being grading period 3. Those are the average scores for each grading period for that group in that content area. And when you kind of see, you can kind of see it's a bit like a roller coaster. They're kind of up and down. We don't see any general growth in any of the content areas for group number 1. And when we got to group number 2, it was kind of a similar story. We didn't see any general increase in their grade per grading period in any of those areas. So that kind of moves us to our actions and next steps. What does this data tell us moving forward? For the actions and next steps, it said further research needs to be conducted on more finite aspects of the student growth. And that is to say that we can definitely see an increase in students' reading performance, and we saw maybe slight correlations between increase in some of the content areas, but overall, we didn't necessarily see that extreme growth. Now, we think that research should specifically be done to ensure that the difference in softwares between being utilized is not the reason for the varied performance. Now, that is to say that Group 1 and Group 2 were actually using two different software programs in their related arts classes to help them to increase their performance in reading. So we just think that further performance needs to be done to make sure that it wasn't the increase in time spent in those areas of reading, saying that it wasn't the software that made the difference instead of the increased time. And then lastly, the other way to increase or other ways to increase GAP students' performance in all academic areas should also be considered, because again, we saw that this increased their performance in reading, but we didn't see that general increase in their proficiency assessments nor their grades. So it's important when we're looking at this, at these different research projects, to understand how that research may have connected to the ISLIC and TSSA standards, which are the national and state level standards for each one of, for principals. So when we're looking at this for ISLIC Standard 2, an educational leader promotes the success of every student by advocating, nurturing, and sustaining a school culture and instructional program conducive to student learning and staff professional growth. So when we're looking at that, you look specifically at the creating an instructional program specifically designed to meet the needs of the students. I think it's pretty clear that in this research that was the full intention, is how can we meet the needs of this group of students who might be falling behind. And then next year, the connection would be the ISLIC Standard 5. An educational leader promotes the success of every student by acting with integrity, fairness, and in an ethical manner. So in selecting this research topic, it seemed pretty clear that the researchers worked thoroughly to understand the school and its diverse student groups, working to identify any group whose academic and social success was not being properly cared for, maybe just needed some improvement, and created a system to track and ensure the accountability for their growth. And then lastly, with TSSA Standard 5, assessments and evaluation, educational leaders use technology to plan and implement comprehensive systems of effective assessment and evaluation. And in this, it just seemed abundantly clear that much technology was used in both the planning and implementing and tracking of the data for these individuals to ensure that we are finding some correlations. Now, in conclusion, we found that research points to the idea that reading is key to the success of all learning. That seemed to be a big thing. When we were actually looking in the literature, most of this literature pointed to reading being a focus in growth. Also, that student schedule was or is an underexplored tactic in increasing student reading ability. And then finally, that increasing of student time spent in reading and language arts has a positive effect on students reading, especially those who have fallen behind. Now here's just our references, and I will happily send those out so you guys can see them, and I appreciate you guys coming out today.